The next one, I'm really happy to introduce our next speaker, Joan McKearnan. Joan has a master's degree from the University of Minnesota in Duluth and a PhD from the University of Maryland. Both degree research projects included studying avian population and habitat ecology. She taught college biology for 35 years, the last 27 years at Anoka Ramsey Community College. She has recently retired, but stays actively involved with the Master Naturalist program, for whom she has taught the initial training class about 15 times. She has conducted numerous bird surveys for the state of Minnesota and Maryland and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We are excited to have Joan present on feather color, structure, and function. And before she kicks off, on a personal note, I have loved working with Joan and their field biology classes at Anoka Ramsey Community College. And for those that don't know, Joan also joined the MOU Education Committee. She's all around awesome. Take it away, Joan.
Thank you, Jen. And I also have enjoyed Jen coming up. She brings up a whole crew of banders and sets up a banding station at, uh, you know, f- uh, for one day. They come up really early in the morning and come up one day to band up at Anoka Ramsey Community College. And one time they even tried to get saw-whet owls, and they were there like at 4 o'clock in the morning trying to get saw-whet owls. All right, I'm going to try sharing here, and hopefully you guys are seeing my screen here.
Looks good. You just have to hop on presenter view.
Yeah, is that good there? Oops.
Gorgeous.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about feathers, color, structure, and function. And so I'm really more of an avian ecologist, but I also, when I was at Anoka Ramsey, I taught animal biology and also anatomy and physiology of humans. And so I've got this interest too in how, uh, you know, birds work, all animals work on the inside too. And so I started teaching about birds, anatomy and physiology in a couple different ways for giving presentations on it. So this one, I'm just going to focus on feathers. And this is a Reeves pheasant, has one of the longest feathers in the world at 7 and almost 8 feet long. That tail feather is okay. So feathers are quite varied and are, to me, very fascinating structure. So what is a feather? Okay, so it is a complex epidermal growth. So your skin is made out of an epidermal layer and then a dermal layer. And so all vertebrate skin has those two layers. And so then this is the epidermis that we see right here. I'm going to get my pen moving if I can. Um, so the epidermis is this brown, darker brown layer that you see right here. And then the dermis is the lighter brown. And so you can see that it kind of like in what we call invaginates in, so goes like this. And then it forms a collar. And I always have, one of the problems that we have when we're presenting is we have things getting in our way from our PowerPoint. So then it forms this kind of collar around there. So we have an inside dermis right here and an outside epidermal layer, or this collar, epidermal collar. Okay. And then what the epidermal collar does is eventually it grows and into the feather. So it starts to form this mid shaft right here, and then all these barbs coming in and forms this cone, this cone shape that then just comes out and fans out when the feather emerges. All right. So it is made out of a compound called keratin, a protein keratin. It's actually the beta bird keratin is unique. It's not found in other vertebrates. It's called beta keratin. And the keratin is what makes up feathers, also claws and the beaks on birds. And it can be soft and it can be hard. And so we see that with birds made out of the same compound. Keratin in our body makes up our hair, our nails, and also found in our skin. All right, it has a central shaft we see right here, and then it has this vein. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. And then feathers are found not only in birds. It used to be like the definitive thing of that a bird is a vertebrate with feathers, but now we found lots of fossils that have uh, that have feathers on them. And so this is a fossil of a dinosaur that was found in China, which has a lot of them. And these are feathers that you can see right in here. They don't have a lot of big veins, as we can see, but in this China place in China, they have just a trove of feathered dinosaurs, and even archosaurs, extinct archosaurs, which are dinosaurs are kind of in this archosaur, and birds. Birds, by the way, are dinosaurs, I should say. So the non-avian extinct dinosaurs and extinct archosaurs, we see feathers and fossils. And then a fun fact, everyone thinks, that skeletons are pretty heavy in animals, and they are in most vertebrates, but in actuality, in birds, they're quite light, and that the plumage in most birds weighs more than the skeleton does. So the plumage might take up to 5 to 10% of a bird's body weight, where the skeleton is usually about 5%. Okay, so what are some of the purposes of feathers? Well, one is they help with flight. Okay, we can see how this is providing lift by providing a reduced air pressure up there as air goes across there, and then a constant pressure here. That reduced pressure then gives us lift, and so the feathers, the wing feathers, are helping with that. Also, insulation for thermal regulation, whether it's insulating the nest while the female is, or male, I should say, the parents are incubating, and also the downy feathers that are found on chicks helps them, retain heat. Okay. Now, also can be protection, and so this is a long-eared owl. When I was in Maryland, I was trapping saw-whet owls, and one day we were lucky enough to get a long-eared owl. And so after banding it, put it on this pine, and then went raced to the house to get my camera before the bird flew away. And as often you do with wildlife, you take a picture when you're far away, and then you try to get up a little bit closer and a little bit closer. So as I was getting closer to this bird, it just came out and got really, really big. So that's not a bird you want to mess around with, according to that bird. And so that defense mechanism of fluffing its feathers out makes it a lot bigger. And so we see that. And it does the same thing. If it's cold, it will also fluff out the feathers too. Feathers also have a waterproofing compound. Some of it is with the oil that birds put on when they're preening, but also just the fact that water tends to beat up on the feathers, and they can't go through the little slats right here that are in the veins there. And so then we see then that there is water just tends to beat up, and so that helps to waterproof the birds when it's raining or when they're diving. And we see that. And then some feathers are also used for making sounds. So this is a snipe, and the tails, it splays out the tail feathers, and the wind going through that, air going through that makes the winnowing call or sound that snipes make in the evening or early morning. Now, feathers are also colored, and so there's purpose then to the coloration. One, of course, is for display, social display. So this is a peacock trying to attract a peahen, and so that they have this, huge display that we know that we're all familiar with. So there's that social kind of display, whether it's for mating or sometimes for, scaring other birds away, other males, let's say, off a territory. Camouflage too. So I was in Australia on a boat trip, and the guide is saying, "Do you see the bird in this picture?" And of course, I didn't really see it until we get close up. So the bird is right here, and this is a Papuan frogmouth male on the nest. So that's very camouflaged that we see for that. So some of the bird coloration is for camouflage, and sometimes it's for just telling males from females or from juveniles, for males. So for identification, which, in answer to a question with Frank, this is just, again, hypothesis speculation, but it might be just easier if the bird is non-breeding plumage to tell breeding birds apart, that I'm ready for mating or I'm not ready for mating. So that again is just hypothesis, and maybe to answer that question somebody asked Frank about plumage. All right, so the parts of a wing. So we have then the main shaft, and the shaft, the part that then has that there's a part that's filled up that's not hollow. That's called the rachis, and then there's a part that is hollow that is called the calamus. And then and so that's and the calamus also is what embeds in the into the skin and sometimes into the bone. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And so then we have that shaft, the rachis versus the calamus, and then we have the vein, which is then the part that's not on the shaft, okay? And so then there, the vein is broken up into the pennaceous portion. Pennate, means feathery, sort of like a feather, feather-like. Okay, and then so we have that vein part where the as we're going to see in a minute, where barbules are connecting to each other, and so they very tightly hooked to each other, versus when there you have very loose barbs down here, which is the plumulaceous, if I said that right, part of the feather. So we see that in many of the feathers will have that plumulaceous part. All right, so looking more closely at that pennaceous part, then we can see then that the vein is made up of these barbs. So each of these barbs go out like this. And then there are barbules. So these are little smaller sections that are right in here. And each barbule is a little hook. Okay. And those hooks then, they're actually called barbicels, so it's not on this term. And each hook then helps it hook onto the other barbules, so it keeps the vein all nice and tight, which then can help with the flight, can help with retaining heat, can help with, waterproofing. All right, and then this is a microscopic picture that shows then, this is a barbule here, or this is a barb right here. This is the barbule, and then you can see the little hooks right there, the barbicels hooking on with each other that we see with that. So this is what keeps the whole feathers all nice and clean. And when they get separated, birds then, will preen them, will take their bill through to help try to get those barbicels all hooked up again and giving a nice clean feather. Okay, there's lots of different types of feathers. And so we have then the contour feathers are the feathers that cover the body, and they're divided into this contour feather that we see right here. And also, these are considered specialized contour feathers. And so the specialized ones include the tail feathers. A singular tail feather is called a retrix. The plural is retrices. So we see that there with the ruffed grouse, and you can see that the vein here is pretty much equal, symmetric. So, and so we see that with most of the tail feathers. We see a wing feather tends to have some asymmetry, and so that there's one side is not as wide as the other side is. And then, excuse me, then and wing feathers are either called singularly a remage or a remix. I've seen different terms used there, but the plural is remiges. Okay. And then we have the contour feathers, other contour feathers that we see right here. So this will have a pennaceous part right here, but then it might have more of a plumulaceous part right in there. And the semi-plume will be the pennaceous part. They're not as connected to each other, so we don't see the barbs as tightly hooked together, and then have a very large plumulaceous part. And so the contour feathers then help to, again, kind of help retain some of the heat, but they're not, so these are the covering, they make up the exterior covering of a bird. And so the interior of a bird will have a lot of down on it. So we'll have these barbules, which are very loose, and no barbicels that are helping to connect them. And of course, they're used for insulation. There's actually three different kinds of down. There's the natal down that a chick has, like we saw in a previous picture. There's the adult down, or body down, as it's called, that we see in a goose, or more famously in eider ducks, and then making our pillows. And then there's the powder down, which is where the feather at the tip just kind of wears away, as the feather never gets replaced, and the feather just gets wears away and produces a powder that's found throughout the body, which can help with. I think it helps with insulation. Not, yeah, just wears away. Yeah, producing a waterproofing, actually waterproofing down. All right. And then we see the phyloplume. So phyloplume is mostly just rachis with a little fluff at the top right there. And then we have the bristle, which has a little bit of fluff at the bottom, and we have the right there. And so phyloplumes then are distributed throughout the body and seem to be mostly involved with like detecting what's the status of feather position. So each feather of these contour feathers usually has a muscle attached to it or part of a muscle sheet, which might move it, to fluff it up or not. And but sometimes the wind moves it, or other things will move the feathers, and the phyloplume will keep track of where those feathers are. So whether the bird is, all nice and together or fluffed up, the phyloplume kind of helps keep track of that. And then bristles can be seem to be used for a variety of reasons. Some bristles are right by the bills, so those are called rictal bristles. And others are like make up the eyelashes on a bird. And so like the ostrich eyelashes. And they seem to be keeping like one function of the bristle seems to be keeping objects out of the eye. So they've done some studies where they thought they were more like helping birds that catch insects on the fly to help detect those. But when they cut them off, they were still just as good at catching these other insects. But they did find that they got more stuff in their eye when the rictal bristles were cut off. So that's just kind of seems to be what those one function of those bristles. Maybe also tactile. And this bird right here is a king of Saxony of bird of paradise. And bird of paradises have very elaborate types of feathers. We're going to look at another one in a few minutes. So that's the really long tail or head feather that we see, contour feather that we see on that bird of paradise. So they can be very adapted for a variety of different things. Fun fact: the number of contour feathers. Somebody counted all the feathers on a hummingbird and found 940. That seems to be the least one on the ruby-throated hummingbird. And the most counted is on a tundra swan at 25,216. And most of those on that swan, 80% of the feathers were on the head and the neck. So not much on the rest of the body, which seems a little unusual. Not sure why that is. All right, so feathers have colors. And so like we have... I have two different feathers that I have right here. And so I have a blue feather and I have a yellow feather. And what makes these colors are different. They have different ways of making these colors. So let's look at how these colors are made on these feathers. Okay, so first of all, just a little bit about light and color interactions. So light, as well, most of you I'm sure know, sunlight, for instance, has all the color wavelengths that us humans can see. So from red to purple, these are wavelengths of 700 to 400 nanometers, a billionth of a meter. And so sunlight, there's three different types of interactions that we see with bird feathers. And that is the sunlight sun hits it, the lights go in, and then the structure of this here will kind of reflect one wavelength back. Okay. And so that then that might give us the blue on this particular bird. And so it's blue at whatever angle you look at it. So we say that it is angle independent. No matter what angle you're looking at it, you're going to get blue. But sometimes we get refraction, and that is the structure of the feathers here, the keratin in there and the air bubbles that are in there will then bend certain wavelengths. So the wavelengths go in, but the purple gets bent this way and the blue might get bent that way. So then you have different colors that are giving us that. That's what causes iridescence in a lot of the feathers. And so, and that is angle dependent. So no matter what the angle you're looking at, it will provide you different colors. So that's due to what we call refraction. And then lastly, we have pigments that then give us emit lights, so that the molecule will absorb all the colors, but then it interacts with them and it gives off the red energy to give us red colors in this particular one right here. So we have two basic kinds of color ways that colors are made in birds. Oh, and actually, before I get to that, I forgot. And if I have time at the end of this, I'm going to show you the video of this, but I'm not going to do it right now. This is showing a superb bird of paradise, and it has a black, this is the male that you can see making this black oval shaped thing there. And that black is able to absorb 99.95% of light, which is better than most black paint can. They're getting some paint that is absorbing more, but most black paint does not absorb that much light. So when we see black, usually some light is being reflected. This bird is absorbing almost nine of that. So that's why you can't even really see that it's a bird in there. And we'll hopefully again see the video of that at the end of this. Okay, so two types of really kind of colors. We have pigments and feathers. And so pigments, then they will re-emit specific wavelengths of light. And so all these feathers that you see right here are given based on one, different wavelength due to pigments. And so, and probably, I'm not 100% sure, but I would say most of these are probably from melanin. Now, we're probably familiar with melanin, and that's what makes hair black or brown or skin color brown or, a brownish color, the variety of different skin colors that we have. And so melanin, that's called eumelanin, like EU. Okay. And those gives us the black, browns, and grays that we see in feathers. And then there's pheomelanin, which gives us the reddish browns and the light yellows. Okay. And so we see that then is melanin. So different types of amount of melanin is laid into these pigment onto the veins or the uh, uh, shaft. Okay. And then carotenoids then are plant-based pigments, and they include things like vitamin A, beta carotene, and they will produce the bright orange on an oriole, reds on the scarlet tanager, and the yellows on a goldfinch, or on this feather, which is a yellow-shafted flicker. Okay. And then very rare, or very uncommon type of pigment are the porphyrins. We see them in some of the owls will have porphyrins. Let's see, I got to remember my whole list of who owls, pigeons, some of the gallinaceous birds, and the brighter porphyrins are like on this terraco bird producing this green or this greenish color. So but these are not very common. So red, brown, greens, and pinks will be produced by these guys. All right. Now, the other type of coloration is structural color. And so this again is based on the layer, the lights, how light then goes through the molecules, which can include keratin, but there might be other molecules in air pockets, so vacuoles, and then the light gets refracted in different ways. So like on this peacock feather, we have all sorts of different types of light, but these are all structural color. And if you were to shine a light through it, it would all look like brown. It wouldn't be, you wouldn't see the blue versus the green in other colors like that. So this produces the greens, the blues, the iridescent looks of like the peacock, or later on I'm going to maybe show a hummingbird, and or like on a grackle. Some of the blackbirds will have that iridescent, and so we see that on there. And even ultraviolet. So birds are capable of seeing ultraviolet light, and so some birds. Oh yeah, before I show you pictures, some colors can be both of a combination of structural and pigment. Some of the colors that we see. So some birds do emit ultraviolet coloration, and some birds can actually see, many of the birds can see this. So this is a European robin, and it then, while it may look dull brown to us, to birds it looks like this bright blue, this ultraviolet color that's coming off of it. And so that's quite a different, way, look to it and can attract. So birds that we think may be dull, and some of them might be dull brown, but some of them may also be to other birds quite, flashy. Okay, so wing terminology, you may be familiar with this. Frank also alluded to using some of the terminology here, but just to kind of give you a little basis for this. So for wing terminology, the primaries are the outermost feathers on the wings, and so they're the wing feathers. And when we look at primaries, the primary feather that we see right here is very asymmetric, so it's very narrow leading edge right here, the edge that's going out that way. And then we have much wider right that we see right there. And so there can be any on birds can vary 9 to 10 primaries in different species. Most songbirds have 10. The ostrich actually has 16 primaries. So that kind of breaks the is an exception, even though it doesn't use those for flight, it uses them for display. And then the secondaries are these feathers that are right here, and they tend to be a little more symmetric, but not perfectly symmetric. And so we see that much wider on the edges on each side of the feathers of the shaft there. And then the tertials are three feathers that are close to the edge, I mean on the inside that we see right there. Now these primaries and secondaries are embedded in bone. So most feathers are just embedded in skin. These are embedded in bone. So the primaries that we see right here are embedded in the carpomanus or carpometacarpus, which makes up the manus. There's also some phalangeal bones right there fused together. So their hand is very fused together, doesn't have as many bones as we do, and so it makes up the manus, which is the hand, the big bone, but the big bone of the manus is the carpometacarpus. So all the primaries are embedded into that bone right in there. And then the secondaries are embedded in the ulna. And you can see these little bumps right here, and that's where the feathers are going into. So the shafts, the calamus of the shafts are embedded into these bones. And then all the other feathers are just into skin. And then we have coverts covering are the other wing feathers, the contour feathers that are covering on the wing are called coverts. And there's primary coverts and greater and lesser coverts and all sorts of different names for these. And just so, for example, for bird ID, we see on the snow goose that how the primaries are right here, we see are all black. And so it gives us that black outer tip we see of primaries. And Frank again mentioned those on the gulls. And then the secondaries, like for our bird identification, it can form a speculum in many of the ducks. And so we have a mallard speculum right here, which helps us identify it from a black American black duck, which doesn't have the white margin that we see right here. It has a black margin. And so while a female mallard might look a lot like a black duck, if you get a good look at that speculum, then you can have that be able to tell those two apart. And then one specialization of primaries that we see are in owls, where they have sort of a fringed or combed edge to it, which allows for their silent flight. So when they're flying through the air, they don't want their prey to hear them. So then they will have these combed edges, which seems to make for a much silent flight. So they can sneak up and get that vole from the snow. Okay. Frank also talked about molting in gulls. The same happens in many of the longer lived birds might have a molting pattern where juveniles and immatures are separate from the adults. So we tend to think juveniles tend to be used for birds of the hatching year. So if they've hatched in June, they are juveniles, and we call that their hatch years. But for banders that are banding a lot in the fall, a lot rafters and at Carpenter and such, they might call those juveniles, and then immatures are the next year birds. And so oftentimes the banders will just use January 1st as hatch year versus after hatch year. But sometimes they might, maybe not banders, but other birds might, ornithologists might look for the next molt as to when they become immature birds. And so then after they then reach the adult plumage, then we refer to that as the definitive plumage. But plumage does change annually. So even if they've reached an adult plumage, and just as a hint here, though, I think Armin did have a picture of that golden eagle. So one way to tell a juvenile bald eagle or an immature bald eagle from a golden eagle is that the golden eagle has this is much more mottled here, and where over here you see the white wing patches there, and then this band, a nice band there, not as mottled on the tail or a wider white area that we see right there. So be careful when you're looking at eagles to tell a golden from a white. Now, in songbirds, most birds will attain their definitive plumage by the second year. Their one exception is the redstarts, and so the redstarts then have the male, is black with his orange patches here, here, and on the there. The female has yellow patches in the same area, but not the black. And so most fall warblers are in their juvenile or plumage, and so that makes fall warbler identification really tricky. But most will, by the following year, in May, you're going to have mostly adults. But you can sometimes, like in the redstart, you might see this bird right here, bird looking like this, singing. This is a second year redstart. Male redstart. It's got the white, the yellowish patches like the female does, but it has a little more black in these areas that tells us that it's a male second year redstart. Okay, the annual molt cycle we see here is feathers do not grow continuously like hair does. And feathers also are dead tissue like hair, so it cannot repair itself. And so the wear and tear on the feathers require replacement. And so birds will molt either annually or semi-annually. Semi-annually tends to be the most common. And when they time it usually so that it's not at a time period when they're at most stress. They wouldn't migrate during migration when they need their wing feathers and using a lot of energy. So they tend to do it after breeding and before winter migration occurs. And so again, sort of a terminology that is used for different to try to standardize terminology for our North American or Northern Hemisphere birds that migrate versus tropical birds that don't migrate. The birders tend to use, or ornithologists tend to use, it's called a basic plumage is the plumage the birds spend most of their time in. So for a goldfinch, it spends most of its time in this duller yellowish brownish color. So that's the basic plumage. And then the alternate plumage is when it spends the least amount of time, but it's when it might be its brightest, like during breeding season. And so it's a little bit counterintuitive than what we think, but that's what the ornithologists are trying to do is standardize from hemispheres and tropical versus polar stuff. Now the waterfowl molt cycle is a little bit interesting because sorry, let me get to it. It is because they will molt at the end of nesting season, so in late summer, and they tend to get rid of all their wing feathers at once. Most birds, as we're going to see in a minute, do it gradually, but the wing mallards will do it. A lot of the ducks do it all at once. So that means there's a time period when the birds cannot fly. And so they're in their eclipse plumage. And so about 3 to 4 weeks in the summertime, they cannot fly. And so the male then will, molt so that it looks a lot like the female, but there are some differences. Sometimes there'll be some green here. It will have, notice how this is a black and white tail here versus sort of a brown tail here. This still has the black and white tail that you see right there. And this has a yellow bill here, not quite as bright as we see with the breeding, but the female has a darker bill with a maybe orange tip on it. So you can see those at the end of summer, though they tend to hide in the marsh and you don't see them quite as well. Okay, molt progression is such that when we look at the wing feathers, the primaries, they tend to molt at the junction of the primaries and the secondaries. So the innermost primary gets molted first, and then this outermost secondary gets molted. And so we can see here then how this is a new feather right here, so that they're beginning to molt right there. And then we have these are old feathers. They're lighter colored. They're frayed. They're not in very good shape. And so they're worn there. And with retrices also, that they tend to start in the middle and then go outward. The one exception to that is the For woodpeckers, they don't, because woodpeckers are very dependent upon, that outer tail right here for propping. And so they don't get rid of their central rectrices until all these have molted first.
Joan, we have about 3 minutes left,
Okay.
just to let you know.
Yeah. So one thing we see in when we're looking at molt patterns that the birders look for or the banders look for is whether there's fault bars, and those are little white lines in there, or sometimes they're darker, which indicate that there's damage to those feathers. Okay. So just to finish it off, here's one of our most beautiful birds, the golden pheasant. But we should always, or the trope is to finish with the sunset. So I'm finishing with the sunset lorikeet right there. Um, that's the stop my sharing right there. Okay. Let me just do, well, okay.
Yeah, you have time to do the videos. If you'd like to
Okay.
do the videos, I think we'd
Yeah.
love to
And
see
they're
them.
sharing. Yeah, I can see that our, let's see. So, oopsie. Oops,
That
sorry.
that was while you're getting it ready to share. That was fantastic, and
Yeah.
I think I'm going to enjoy sharing that recording, provided all the recording goes well with all our entry
Okay.
level banders. They're
Let's
going to love
see.
it.
I gotta find where I put all my, for some reason, I think I should in my, I'm not seeing my Google application on my share. Oh, there it is. Okay. Oh, okay. All right. So first of all, let me just mention Feather Atlas. So if you ever come across a feather in the woods, you want to know what it is, check out the Feather Atlas so you can do identification with that. Here's the ruby-throated hummingbird, just again to kind of show you how that iridescent works and how different everyone is seeing this, I'm hoping. So there's the ruby. You can see how that iridescent occurs. Depending upon what angle you're looking at, you can see that ruby throat. Okay. And then lastly, here's that superb bird of paradise, being black, and then it flays out those feathers. It's just there we go. I don't know if you can get the sound on this. But anyways, it's doing this little clicking sound as it's trying to attract that very dull female. So that's the dance of the superb paradise. All right. So what question I see there's things in the chat. I don't know if they're all about Keystone. Any other questions?
Doesn't look like we have any in the chat, Joan, but I think if
Okay.
anybody has any questions for Joan, you can go ahead and put them in the chat and Joan should be able to answer those. Thanks, Joan. That was really, really
Okay.
great.
Yeah, thanks.